Welcome back to the Sleep Summit. Dr. Mike Nelson here. Sleep versus caffeine. Mortal enemies or potential friends. How to use caffeine and still get stellar sleep. Thank you so much for the invite. Greatly appreciate it and hope you enjoy this talk. One of the things I've been fascinated about with sleep is, no one else probably wonders about this stuff, but how do dolphins sleep? Right? Have you ever seen a picture of a dolphin just like in an underwater hammock taking a nap? I haven't. It turns out that dolphins do something called unihemispheric slow wave sleep. So there's your new term for the day. Unihemispheric slow wave sleep. Within a 24-hour period, each half of the brain gets about 4 hours of slow wave sleep. So they are still sleeping, but they're doing something different. So I always wondered, are dolphins underwater, like drinking a bunch of coffee and hanging out? You never see them sleep, so what's actually going on? My second thought was, once I realized that they do this unihemispheric slow wave sleep, I was wondering if humans could do that. Could we get some stuff done during the day and have half our brain still sleep? It appears no. But anyway, these are the things I wonder about in relation to sleep. And in this talk, we're going to talk about sleep, of course. And we're also going to talk a fair amount about one of my favorite drugs. Yes, it is a drug. Is caffeine in the form of coffee and other delivery methods. The reason I think this is important is because if you work as a trainer or a coach or yourself, most people are not going to give up their coffee, are not going to give up their caffeine. In a perfect world, would their sleep probably improve? Yes, I think there is a time and a place for that. Personally, I like to take about 7 to 14 days off of caffeine entirely, about once per year. Do I have any data to back that up? No, I don't. I just feel to reset my tolerance for caffeine every once in a while is probably good. So we're going to give you some practical tips on sleep and how to use caffeine at the same time, because this is a real world talk, especially if you're a trainer or a coach. Telling your client to never drink coffee or use caffeine is probably unrealistic. Now, of course, if you've got some people using a ton of caffeine. I had a client once before that was probably using, when we added everything up, about 1 gram of caffeine per day, which is ungodly high. Now, I do not recommend that. If you look in most of the health and safety literature, although it's debatable what this is based on, 400 milligrams is probably the upper limit. That's not really based on acute toxicity or anything, no, so it's curious where that number comes from. But in terms of different health organizations, you'll see that as a top number. And we'll explain what in English does that actually mean if you're not a geek like me used to counting milligrams of caffeine. So 1 gram of caffeine a day is literally 1,000 milligrams, which is crazy high. Not recommended. So a quick biography, I did a PhD in exercise physiology at the University of Minnesota. I was primarily looking at metabolic flexibility for my dissertation. I started that research in 2006. I presented to DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. They do all the really super cool stuff for the military in terms of research. If you have a cell phone, that's where it originally came from, GPS. The ARPANET, which was originally a DARPA project, now called the Internet. So that's pretty fun. Do peer review, published research. I did a master's in mechanical engineering, biomechanics, BA in natural science. I own a business, Extreme Human Performance, where I do a lot of consulting and work with athletes of all types. I'm associate professor at the Carrick Institute for Clinical Neuroscience, instructor at Rocky Mountain University, certified sports nutritionist, and certified strength and conditioning specialist. In short, you can think of 3 things that are dark. I like listening to dark death metal. I love coffee during the day and dark beer at other times, we'll say. And Guinness actually has a coffee Guinness now, and it is amazing. I highly recommend it. I was curious when I did this, and I have a whole sleep component in the Flex Diet certification. Quick information on that at the end. But what is this sleep record? Like, how long can a human being go without sleep? Because we know that sleep is a requirement. We know there's a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't work very well if you don't get enough sleep. And it turns out there's a guy named Randy Gardner. He was scientifically documented and still currently holds the record for days without sleep. So longest a human has intentionally gone without any sleep at all. Now, a key component here is that as part of the rules back then, this was 1964, you were not allowed to use any stimulants of any kind. So no caffeine, no amphetamines, no nothing like that. So in 1964, he stayed awake for a total of 11 days and 25 minutes, which is crazy. If you've ever been in college and pulled an all-nighter, unfortunately I've done that a few too many times, that is even hard. Like the next day and the next evening, man, I was completely wrecked. And that was actually using caffeine. So I can't imagine 11 days. This was a world record, and it was later outlawed because they said it was way too dangerous. So this record will probably never be broken again, and good reason for that. So most of the time, if you have a course, sleep management course, this is what happens to people. Hopefully this doesn't happen to you. So I thought it was interesting to go through, again, as an NM1, what was documented. And if you notice here, this is actually documented in the reference. You can pull the reference there if you like. So day 2, difficulty focusing eyes and signs of astrogenosis, which is difficulty recognizing objects only by touch. I probably slaughtered the pronunciation of that. Day 3, moodiness. Some signs of ataxia, which is an inability to repeat simple tongue twisters. Day 4, irritability and uncooperative attitude, memory lapses and difficulty concentrating. Probably not a shocker. Gardner had his first hallucination that was that a street sign was a person, followed by a delusional episode in which he imagined he was a famous black football player. This is only on day 4. He's getting completely goofy. Day 5, more hallucinations. Seen a path extended from the room in front of him down through a quiet forest. Gardner recognized at least that after a short while that the visions were illusionary in nature, but he's literally seeing things that are not there. Day 6, speech slowing and difficult naming common objects. And it goes on. Day 7 and 8, irritability, speech slurring, and increased memory lapses. Day 9, episodes of fragmented thinking, frequently beginning but not finishing his sentences. Day 10, paranoid, focused on a radio show host who Gardner felt was trying to make him appear foolish because he was having difficulty remembering some details about his vigil. Day 11, expressionless appearance, speech slurred and without intonation, had to be encouraged to talk to get him to respond at all. His attention span was very short. His mental abilities were completely diminished. I think this is at least interesting to see what happens when someone does not get any sleep. Now, they didn't do any physical testing as far as I know, so need no physiological measurements or anything like that. But super interesting and not recommended. This was, as we mentioned, later outlawed, so it will never be repeated. They did do a couple of tests. One of them was what's called a Series 7's test, where the respondent starts with the number 100, proceeds downward by subtracting 7 each time. Gardner got back to 65 with only 5 subtractions and then stopped. When asked why he had stopped, he claimed that he couldn't remember what he was supposed to be doing. I had a stint where I was helping with the Ram Race Across America, and for the first, it was over 48 hours, I was awake straight and then did not get much sleep the entire rest of the week. And I completely lost my short-term memory on day 3. We had to drive some vehicles ahead of time to drop off some people who were biking. Yes, they're literally riding their bikes from San Diego at that time all the way to Atlantic City, New Jersey. I was helping out on a team of 4. I really did not have any short-term memory after day 3. So we would look at the odometer and we'd be like, okay, we're going to go 8 miles, and then this rider will switch with the next rider we had in the car. I had to have my co-pilot write down the numbers on the odometer, because literally after I called out the numbers to him, I couldn't remember the numbers if my life depended upon me. So weird, strange stuff happens when we don't get sleep. The 2017 Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine has been awarded to 3 of the principal scientists who contributed to the discovery of the network of genes and proteins regulating the circadian rhythms based on the light-dark 24-hour cycle. So a Nobel Prize has been awarded for works on circadian clocks. And when you look into this research, it's super fascinating. You'll find that the SCN is kind of your main super clock in your brain. And when we look at other cells so far, almost all of them have their own what they call clock genes. So the SCN, via different hormones, is appearing to regulate all of these, but there's these little backup clocks that are located in literally almost every cell that they've studied so far. So we know that timing of things is going to be super important. It appears the body has all sorts of backup systems, as we would expect, in that entire layout. What is the cost of sleep loss? Now evidence that many major disasters have been due to sleep debt-related effects. Oil spill of the Exxon Valdez, nuclear accidents such as Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and loss of the Space Shuttle Challenger. So there is an extremely high cost to sleep loss, which you could make an argument that if people are going to continue to have short periods of sleep loss, especially at a high cost, maybe caffeine might be useful. But what are the pros and the cons of it? Because one of my little favorite sayings, I can't remember who I stole this from, is there's no physiologic free lunch. There's going to be something to pay for everything that goes on in physiology. One of my little phrases I like, I think I made this up, caffeine is a credit card of sleep. So can you use coffee or caffeine to get by for periods of time and feel more awake and literally have better physiologic testing in most cases? Yes, you can. But what are the costs that are going to be associated with that? So I think of it as a credit card, where yeah, if you don't have money, you can buy something now, but there's an interest rate and you've got to pay it back, and there's these things on the back end that you definitely want to know about. So one of the main arguments is coffee unsafe? So there's been some people who have been extremely vocal stating that people who use coffee, this is very unsafe, it is damaging to your health. So I just wanted to go over the literature on that really quick to see what it says. So again, this is just related to coffee. This is something called an umbrella review. So this is an umbrella review of meta-analyses. So meta-analyses is a study of study. So they are literally compiling studies of studies of studies. This one from Poole stated, coffee consumption appears to be generally safe within usual levels of intake. Again, all things in some level potentially can hurt or kill you. If you drink too much water too fast, you can die of hyponatremia. So literally water can potentially kill you. So everything has a risk reward profile. So within usual levels of intake, with summary estimates indicating largest risk reduction for various health outcomes at 3 to 4 cups per day, and more likely to benefit health than harm. So some data from an umbrella review showing that coffee consumption generally safe. And if your coffee is calling, then yes, you do want another coffee. Coffee, caffeine, and health outcomes, another umbrella review. Of the 59 unique outcomes examined in the selected 112 meta-analyses. So meta-analyses, they're taking a composition of studies, and now they took 112 meta-analyses. These are done, of course, observational studies. Coffee was associated with a probable decreased risk of breast cancer, risk of breast, colon rectal, colon, endometrial, prostate cancers, cardiovascular disease and mortality, Parkinson's disease, and type 2 diabetes. So reduced risk in several main diseases. I don't know, I just thought this was freaky. Sloths are just weird. Coffee and cancer risk. Of course, it'll vary upon the type of cancer along with a host of other factors. The study said we reviewed available evidence on coffee drinking and the risk of all cancers and selected cancers updated to May of 2016. Coffee consumption is not associated with overall cancer risk. Now, again, I'm just, pulling the highlights here, which, is always dangerous. But again, more data to show coffee may actually be beneficial. Risk of other diseases like dementia and Alzheimer's. These results do not support an association between coffee consumption and an increased risk of overall dementia or Alzheimer's disease specifically, but further research on the association of coffee consumption with dementia risk is needed. Now, you could add further research is needed on, just about every study. But again, nothing showing that coffee is bad there. Caffeine in general, one of the best albums of all time, Faith No More's Angel Dust. If you look at that, caffeine is track number 2. Pretty impressive. So coffee. These findings from this systematic review and meta-analyses based on approximately, yes, that's right, over 1 million study participants. So people who have argued that maybe all these studies are underpowered, they don't look at enough people, they literally had over 1 million participants in this systematic review and meta-analyses. You can read all the little data there if you want. Takeaway, moderate coffee consumption, 3 to 5 cups per day, was associated with a lower cardiovascular risk. And heavy coffee consumption, greater than 6 cups per day, was neither associated with a higher nor a lower risk of cardiovascular disease. So again, more data to show that even at relatively high intakes, coffee does appear to be safe, and at lower to moderate intakes may be beneficial for health. Now again, these are general population studies on people who overall probably not the best metabolic health. What about heart health? Short answer is probably don't need to worry. Like I said, that study there had over 1 million combined study participants. So some people online will argue that this mechanistic mouse cell line data shows that caffeine in coffee is bad. I would say, nope. We've got literally umbrella meta reviews showing that coffee is safe in moderate amounts and may actually be beneficial to your health on various different parameters. Although the study was cool, effects of caffeine on alcohol drinking in mice. So I tried to find the paper to see if there's pictures of mice drinking coffee, but no, it wasn't in there. First I drink the coffee, then I get to do things. Last one here. So what about something called NAFLD, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? A significant decrease of NAFLD among coffee drinkers. Moderate coffee consumption, again, they define that as 2 to 4 cups per day, was associated with a reduced all-cause and cause-specific mortality, right? So mortality, your risk of dying, compared to no coffee consumption. So people run around stating that, hey, no coffee consumption is much better for your health. Most of the data does not support that. Now again, if you want to live a boring life without coffee, I feel sorry for you, but again, that's your choice. But based on the current data, most of that says that coffee is actually potentially a health food in moderate amounts. This most likely has to do with antioxidants. There's over 1,000 different bioactives that we've identified so far in coffee, and some of it may have to do with the effects of caffeine. But like I said at the beginning, there's always a cost and there's always a reward. So what is the gotcha? We need to look out for coffee and caffeine. Again, most of the data shows that coffee generally can be regarded as safe. And then here is your reference if you want to go crazy with where I pulled those from. Let's dive into a little bit about the main stimulant in coffee, and it is very ubiquitous in at least the US. Caffeine, by far and away the most used drug in the US, if not potentially the world. And yes, caffeine is a drug. So background, I did some work for the ISSN. I helped out with the early position stand on energy drinks. I published a study in JISSN, cardiovascular and ride time to exhaustion effects of an energy drink. Again, the main component of energy drinks for this is going to be caffeine. Sleep is for the weak, coffee is for the strong. So again, we'll talk about what are some of the potential things you should watch out for in relation to coffee, caffeine, and sleep. And if you want to go really crazy, there's the International Society of Sports Nutrition position stand on caffeine and exercise performance. Yes, I'm pimping out all my own studies here. I was a third author on that. It was like 3.5 years of my life and it was a pain in the ass to do. So it's open access. If you really want to dive down, that is a extremely useful resource that you can get open access and go crazy with that. So sleep deprivation, it hurts. So a lot of people are probably using caffeine in place of sleep. So what are some of the consequences of that? Basically, caffeine is what's called an antagonist of the adenosine receptors. So in the brain, it is working on the adenosine receptors. Those are one of the components of the sleep-wake cycle. So could you substitute caffeine for sleep? Acutely, yes. A lot of the tests looking at psychomotor capabilities and different things show that caffeine does a pretty good job of ameliorating some of the effects of short sleep. Now again, do you want to do this every day? Probably not. The hard part is when we look at studies for sleep, as you become more tired, you have a loss of awareness of, paradoxically, being tired. So my buddies who are sleep researchers, they always get subjects who come in, they're like, I don't need sleep. I can get by on, 5 or 6 hours a night. And they're like, cool, come into our lab. They stick them in a dark room. They have them do a boring, repetitive task. And they said a lot of times within sometimes 10 to 15 minutes, these people literally fall asleep. So again, when you're more tired, you don't really know how tired you are because your awareness to determine it goes right down in the toilet. Of course, caffeine can interfere with sleep. So it is true that if you, shocker, consume a bunch of caffeine, you probably can't fall asleep, and it does mess with your sleep. Everybody's probably figured that out by now. The caveat is that there are fast versus slow metabolizers of caffeine. Some people will have enzymes that kind of cytochrome P450 and the subsets of that. They will chew through the caffeine and metabolize it, break it down very fast. A smaller percent of the population are slow metabolizers. I have had some clients like that. They have 1 cup of coffee at noon, and they can't go to sleep at 8, 9, or even 10 p.m. Their body is still seeing these high levels of caffeine because it's taking them a longer time to break it down. How do you know which one you are? You can do a genetic test. This is one area where genetic testing is actually pretty reliable and potentially useful. But you can do the old school method of, hey, did you consume some caffeine and do you have a hard time going to sleep? If you do, bump your caffeine consumption earlier and earlier in the day. Now again, there's a whole bunch of things related to this. We'll talk about the amounts of caffeine. There's a tolerance effect and a bunch of other things. But most people probably don't need to do a genetic test. You can just do an old experiment within a couple days. You can have a very good idea of where you're at on that spectrum. Like I said, just like all drugs, you will generally have a tolerance effect over time. The effects of caffeine will be generally less. Now, there's some caveats within that. Some effects of caffeine don't seem to be as related to tolerance effect. But in general, you will need more caffeine to get the same effect for most things that you would measure. And there is some dopamine response related to all of this too. We'll also discuss the half-life of caffeine. This is the amount of time it takes your body to break that amount into, as it says, half. This is very useful if you use caffeine and you still want to get very good sleep. So understanding this half-life, or what's called PK, pharmacodynamics, is very useful. Great book. This is Your Mind on Plants, Opium, Caffeine, and Mescaline by Michael Pollan. The parts on there on caffeine are really interesting about how coffee originated and came to the U.S., the use of coffee breaks for production. And if you've ever worked in a corporate environment, I worked for a medical device company for about 12 years, and we had an instance a couple times where the coffee vendor didn't show up or forgot to bring in coffee. I don't know what happened. But man, that was probably like the worst thing that has ever happened in an office environment. People get very cranky. They don't have their coffee. And yes, I am one of them. So we can argue that a lot of production in the US, for better or worse, runs on coffee and caffeine. So a quick rundown of caffeine PK. So if we're looking at the chemistry of coffee, what are average caffeine amounts? These are from Starbucks. The reason that I use Starbucks is Starbucks does a lot of work to try to make their coffees the most consistent from one location to the next. If you ever complained that your coffee from Starbucks tastes a little burnt, which I think it does, they do that kind of on purpose, is what I've been told, because it's more consistent. So 155 milligrams of caffeine in a short 8-ounce cup of coffee. This is from Starbucks. I don't know too many people that only drink 8 ounces of coffee, though. 235 milligrams in a tall 12-ounce cup of coffee, which is probably similar to what most people are doing. 310 milligrams in a grande 16-ounce cup, and then 410 milligrams in a venti 20-ounce cup. I guess venti is like Starbucks language for extra large, because maybe they don't want to realize how much coffee they're drinking. So about 400 milligrams in a very large 20-ounce cup of coffee from Starbucks. This is probably one of my favorite studies related to caffeine. Yes, I'm a weirdo and have like favorite studies. Caffeine content of specialty coffees from McCluster. What they did is super interesting. It's not like a very in-depth study, but fascinating, and I don't think it's enough airtime. There is a wide range of caffeine content in coffee. So a lot of people assume that, hey, I had some coffee, I have the same amount of caffeine in there. And the reality is, nope. The amount of beans and type will affect it. Actually, darker roasts have slightly less caffeine because the caffeine is broken down in the roasting process. If you're using Arabic or Robusta beans, they have different amounts of caffeine. Robusta beans have a lot more caffeine than Arabic beans. They generally are a little bit cheaper. Some people don't think they taste as well, but there's some pretty good blends that kind of use both. How you brew it, how much water, heat, temperature, extraction, all that stuff makes a difference. But what they did in this study is they looked at the mean caffeine content for brewed specialty coffees from these fancy coffee shops, and it was about 188 milligrams for a 16-ounce cup. Okay, great. So now you're thinking, I got a 16-ounce cup. This is easy. I got 200 milligrams of caffeine. Off I go. Everything is great. However, there is an extremely wide range of caffeine concentrations. Now, based on what I just said above, with different types of beans, brewing methods, etc., you would expect this. So they saw a range of 259 to 564 milligrams per dose. So for dose here, we're just thinking about they're just grabbing the same amount. So the fluid amount isn't changing. Because obviously, if you consume a bigger cup of coffee, there's more fluid, there's more coffee, there's going to be more caffeine. So they wanted to standardize that. What they saw was a difference of, on the low end, 259 milligrams up to 564 milligrams. So that's almost twice as much. Now here's the catch. It was literally the same coffee. It was obtained from actually the same outlet. It was actually, it looks like it was from a Starbucks. So the same coffee, I think it was a medium blonde, from the same Starbucks. So this is the same bean, the same brewing method, even the same freaking Starbucks. And they did this over 6 days. They probably had some poor undergrad or PhD student go to the Starbucks and get coffee every day, and they ran it through the fancy organic chemistry stuff, and they looked at the amount of caffeine. And what they found was, in the same coffee from the same outlet, the same type, from a company that is trying to standardize it as much as humanly possible, there was an extremely wide range of caffeine. You can find this in other studies too. So this is one of my second favorite studies. influence of various factors on caffeine content in coffee brews. If you really want to know what's going on with all of that, this kind of breaks down everything from the type of bean, the roasting method, and all that stuff. So my big takeaway here is that when you're using coffee for caffeine amount, even when you standardize it to the same type and you're doing everything about the same as you can do, the amount of caffeine you get is going to vary widely. Now again, this isn't bad. This doesn't mean you should stop drinking coffee. But this also explains why if you get a certain coffee from one place and the next place, and I had my coffee, let's say at 2 p.m. in the afternoon, I slept fine. My sleep was great. I do this a week later from a different coffee shop at the same time. Now I'm like wide awake at night and I can't figure out like what's going on. Probably the amount of caffeine is different. So again, I don't think there's enough information about that. So coffee, only 1 cup, please. We can see changes in sleep architecture with caffeine. I'm only going to spend 1 slide on this. Caffeine will typically prolong sleep latency. So in English, this means that, shocker, you drink a lot of caffeine, it's going to be harder for you to fall asleep at your same bedtime or your early time. Increased sleep latency. It generally then will also reduce total sleep time. Usually it's because you're not getting to bed until later. It also reduces sleep efficiency. So you're going to toss and turn. You're not going to get quite the same quality of sleep. Also can worsen perceived quality. So from the study, slow wave sleep and EEG, slow wave activity were typically reduced, whereas stage 1 wakefulness and arousals were increased. Again, this is why people use caffeine. Unfortunately, for sleep, not the best idea. It will 100% mess with your sleep. I'm going to take a quick nap and 3 hours later. All right, so what are some practical things you can do? Again, most people are probably not going to give up their caffeine, myself included. You could switch to different types of tea. This works for a lot of clients. One thing we'll do, I do some assessments for Rapid Health also. We'll literally write in their plan, okay, stop coffee consumption, say, by noon, and stop green tea consumption by 2 or 3 p.m. All right, so we're still giving them the option of some caffeine, but we're trying to limit it overall. There's something else you can do that I call the quick brew method. If you want to extract more caffeine, now this isn't 100%, but it'll get most of it. This is for teas. So most caffeine will go into solution within about the first 60 seconds. So if you're brewing tea and you want more of the caffeine, you can then put the 2 tea bags in there for 60 seconds, take that out, and then I put them in another hot water and let them seep for about 15 minutes. So that first cup of tea that I only have the tea bags in for about 60 seconds, I'm going to get most of the caffeine out. Where they are sitting for a longer period of time, they will have less caffeine. Sometimes I will do this when I'm training in later afternoon, but feel like I want a little bit of a caffeine. So I'll heat 2 cups of water. I'll dunk the tea bags in there for 60 seconds. That'll give me most of the caffeine. I'll consume that an hour before I train. Usually I train at 1 in the afternoon, sometimes 2. And then I don't care too much about the taste of the tea, so I'll just leave the tea bags in there while I'm training. Again, tea enthusiasts will be shocked and horrified at that. It does taste a little funky, but most of the caffeine is already out. I've consumed that early. And then I still get all the benefits of the nice antioxidants, EGCG, and other good components that are in tea. Now, green tea in general, again, it varies on the tea amount, but for about 1 tea bag is 30 to 50 milligrams. Of course, you can get decaffeinated teas also. So on the high end, If I'm doing 2 tea bags, I'm going to get around 100 milligrams, which is still on the lower side. Black tea has about 50 to 60 milligrams. Again, there is a fair amount of variation within that. Something called pu'er tea has a little bit more and more variability, around 30 to 100 milligrams. So sometimes I've recommended black tea. The pu'er tea has a little bit more caffeine. So you can do that kind of quick brew method if you want more of the caffeine at a particular time, or you want less of it later. Now again, this isn't an absolute 100%, but it's a poor man's way of changing the caffeine amount in tea. Now, as far as I'm aware, this doesn't quite work with coffee, but works with tea. Haha, little koala bears sleep way more than 8 hours. They're just such weird looking animals. All right, so another thing you can do is the caffeine power nap. Now again, is this recommended for daily use? No, but you can consume some form of anhydrous caffeine. So anhydrous caffeine is literally just straight powdered caffeine. In the US, if you look at something called no-dose in general is going to be about 200 milligrams per tablet or per capsule. The reason I like doing this is because we mentioned about coffee. Coffee can be extremely variable in the amount of caffeine. So I'll typically use no-dose and consume that. Amount 100 to 200 milligrams. If you're using the tablets, you can buy just standard tablets from other places other than no-dose. A half a tablet in general is going to be 100 milligrams. A full tablet's going to be 200. So make sure you read the label on that. And then I'll try to take a nap for about 30 to 40 minutes. You can get fancy and do some Andrew Huberman NSDR in place of sleep if you want. And when you wake up, you'll have peak blood levels of caffeine and you had a nap. This is because the peak levels of caffeine in general are going to be about 30 to 45 minutes. Now, of course, if you ate a huge meal, that'll affect it. If you haven't eaten anything, it'll be a little bit sooner. But peak blood levels, in general, around 30 to 45 minutes, sometimes 60 minutes. If you consume this, then you'll have sleep, and you'll wake up, have a little bit higher levels of caffeine at the same time. Now, again, I would not recommend this for daily use. If you find yourself doing this all the time, you definitely probably need to reassess your priorities and get more sleep. I did this when I was doing my PhD. I was also working part-time and I was running my business. Went back to school to do my PhD full-time, and my little 2001 jet at the time, I kept a pillow in the back. So I would get to the lab around, if I had to do clients, I'd get up at 4:30. I'd be in the lab by usually 5:15. I'd be testing people probably by 6 after the equipment got up and running, run through a bunch of tests depending on what we had to do that day. And then I was pretty sleep deprived, so I had a 30-minute block usually from 9 a.m. to 9:30. So I would go out to my car and literally crawl in the back with my pillow, take 200 milligrams of caffeine, and do a caffeine power nap in the morning. Now, caveat, as you can imagine, if you're doing this at 9 o'clock in the morning to get through your day, something's definitely out of whack. Again, not recommended for daily use. I try not to do it every day, but on those days I had to get some testing done, which is usually Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Yeah, it did happen. And once I did finish my PhD, I literally slept for long periods of time for several months. But in a pinch, you can do the caffeine power nap. And if you want to get super crazy, there's other ways. This is administration of micronized caffeine using a novel oral delivery film that results in rapid absorption. This was shown on EEG. And what they did is they had caffeine that they ground really small, and they put it in a film that you stick inside your mouth. And they did show like rapid increases in caffeine within a few minutes. So there are other forms and different ways you can get caffeine in if you really need it in a pinch and you can't afford to take a nap. Now, one of the pros of the rapid absorption is that you get it in sooner, and hopefully those levels will start to decay, and they'll decay sooner and you can still get sleep. So one of the biggest issues I see with people is they are consuming generally coffee and they're consuming it later in the day, let's say 3 p.m. or whatever, and then they can't sleep at night. So if you really don't want to give up your caffeine, my advice is move your coffee to earlier in the AM. That way, if the caffeine amount is higher, it's not going to be nearly a big a deal, especially if you're a fast metabolizer. And then if you're really hurting and you need caffeine to get through later afternoon, I do the no-dose or the anhydrous caffeine and much more of a standardized dose. So that makes it easier to figure out what's actually going on. The same thing if you're using this primarily for exercise benefit and you're really trying to titrate things in. If I work with powerlifters or endurance athletes, etc., most of the time when we're really trying to dial it in for acute performance, I will almost always use anhydrous caffeine just because it is much more of a known quantity and is much easier to replicate on their game day. Can we do anything to potentially alter the half-life? So the half-life is the amount of time it takes the caffeine to be broken down to lower and lower levels, literally 1/2 of the time. There are things that potentially increase the half-life of caffeine. So from about 6.2 hours, this was in an untreated group, up to 10.7 hours in a treated group. So you're probably wondering, okay, what was the untreated and what was the treated group? So in the untreated group, the half-life of caffeine they measured was about 6.2 hours, meaning that if they had, let's say, 200 milligrams of caffeine at noon, 6.2 hours later, so 6:20 p.m., they had still 100 milligrams of caffeine. In the treated group, this was 10.7 hours later. Holy crap, that's a long time. It almost doubled the half-life. What was this? Actually, it's oral contraceptives in women. So I've had a few clients now who their sleep was a disaster. We couldn't figure out what the hell was going on. And it turns out they were on oral contraceptives. And they were probably more in this 10 hours. So I'm thinking in my head, okay, caffeine, 2.5 to 5 hours, maybe 6 hours is the half-life. There's variability there. And we kept moving the caffeine back and back, and we still couldn't figure it out. So I kept looking in the literature and found that oral contraceptives dramatically change the half-life. So if you're using an oral contraceptive, you probably have to move your caffeine intake even earlier in the day because it's going to take your body almost twice as long to break it down, which means you're going to have higher levels when you are trying to go to sleep. So that to me is a huge difference. This is some old data from 1990, 1992. But again, one of those things is that not many people know about and something to definitely watch out for. I had one case where a person was consuming coffee, which has variable caffeine amount. They were on an oral contraceptive, and their sleep was just horrible. We couldn't figure it out. We eventually found the study. We had her move her caffeine to only, in her particular case, in the morning, and her sleep cleared up and was actually really, really good just by moving caffeine amounts around. Are there things you can do to speed up caffeine? Could you take something in the evening or after your caffeine dose that would speed up the breakdown of it, right? Because remember, these curves, when we look at them, we'll see peak blood levels and then they're going to slowly go back down. So could we take something that would, in essence, change this curve? So this is your peak levels here. Could we have this curve productivity and then go off, and then you can sleep really good, and you could still, if you wanted to, use higher amounts of caffeine during the day. So I've looked at all this research for, many, many years. There is some stuff on modification of what's called the cytochrome P450 IA2. Cytochrome P450 is one of the main enzymes that breaks down caffeine, in addition to a lot of other drugs. This can be changed by effects of smoking, which is interesting because if you notice that a lot of people who smoke tend to consume coffee and caffeine. It can be affected by broccoli and even exercise. So there's some theories that if you want to reduce the amount of caffeine or its effect, exercise may be beneficial for that. So in this study from 1991, they did show that those things did have changes on the activity of the cytochrome P450 enzyme. The hard part is I can't find any study that really says it made a difference, because most of these studies I've seen, there's no direct measure of the amount of caffeine still in the blood. So it's a theoretical thing. If you look at the internet, it says bananas, exercise, and water. There's some other stuff. I think it was from Charles Poliquin, who said high doses of vitamin C. I found no data on bananas. Maybe on exercise, water, maybe. Maybe you're just dehydrated and that's why you feel like crap. Vitamin C, I can't find any data on that either. Broccoli, as I mentioned, maybe, but we can't find any studies that do direct measures. Is there anything that you can do to speed up the metabolism of caffeine? Say you had coffee a little bit too late with your friends and you still want to sleep tonight. Could you eat like a couple bowls of broccoli and still be able to sleep? Sadly, probably not. You could try it. I don't think there's any harm in that. I wouldn't recommend smoking. You could also try exercise. The down part is that many times if you exercise late in the day, that can also affect your sleep. Historically, I've seen that strength training will tend to mess with people's sleep more than cardiovascular training. That's just the observation I've made over the years of training clients for 15 years. There is a drug that can do it though, but is it worth it? Probably not. So here's some of the side effects of a drug that has been shown to radically change caffeine metabolism. You can see a temporarily discoloration, yellow, reddish, orange, or brown color of your skin, teeth, saliva, urine, stool, sweat, and tears. That doesn't sound fun. Itching, flushing, headaches, drowsiness, dizziness, lack of coordination, and difficulty concentrating. The drug is called Rifidin. It is an older drug, and it's primarily an antibiotic that's used once in a while. As far as I know, I think it might be IV use only. That is the only thing I found that can change caffeine pharmacokinetics. So in this study, they took 10 healthy volunteers before and after a 7-day treatment with 600 milligrams of the drug. There was significant changes in plasma half-life. It actually dropped it substantially. So in this study, their average without the drug was 6.2. That matches most of the other data we've seen, and dropped it almost in half to 3.5. Excuse me. And also affected plasma clearance of it. The downside is, as I mentioned, lots of side effects, prescription. I think it's an IV only. Definitely not recommended, but in terms of mechanism, that's the only thing I could find. So in general, do we have anything that will speed up caffeine metabolism? No, not that I can find. Last component here too, keep in mind that if we take, let's say, a 5-hour mark as the half-life of caffeine. Let's say you're a moderate metabolizer, and we'll pin the half-life of caffeine at 5 hours. If you train at 2 p.m. and you have a pre-workout that has 200 milligrams of caffeine, a lot of them have even more than that now, so read your label. This would mean that at 7 p.m., you still have 100 milligrams of caffeine floating around your bloodstream. Again, we can argue, is it good, is it bad? But if the half-life is 5 hours, half of it, you're going to be around 100 milligrams. Now, a lot of these half-lives are not necessarily linear, but we're just doing this for the sake of argument. Now, let's say you keep it the same time, but you're getting crazy and you up the dose to 400 milligrams. So at 7 p.m., your half-life would be 200 milligrams. That would be like taking a no dose at 7 p.m., which probably not really recommended. So the reason I point this out is that, remember, the half-life matters, and then also the dose of caffeine matters. Now, I will be one of those people that confesses that, yeah, on my heavy lifting days, I like around 300 milligrams of caffeine, but I've had much better luck by moving that session to about 11 a.m. And that seems to be, at least in my case, I'm a very fast metabolizer of caffeine. I'm still able to sleep a lot more and a lot better that night. So dose and timing for caffeine matter. Again, as we mentioned, if you're using coffee, this can be highly, highly variable and is much harder to pin down. All right, so our summary. What do we do with this? What does any of this mean? So sleep is very important. Yes, we need our sleep. Coffee does have some health benefits. Caffeine will mess with your sleep, so there isn't really any magical things we can do to change that. But the reality is, expecting most of your clients or yourself to go on a no caffeine diet is also unrealistic. So what do we do to mitigate the effects of caffeine on sleep? Consider stopping caffeine use earlier. If I have clients who have a hard time sleeping and we see caffeine consumption later in the day, the first thing I'm going to have them do is leave their caffeine consumption the same or cut it down or move it much earlier in the day. There is considerable genetic variability. We do know that. Most people will know if they're a slow or a fast metabolizer of caffeine. Watch out for other drugs and things that can change the metabolism of caffeine. Now, the big one there is, as we mentioned, oral contraceptives, especially in women. That will extremely prolong the half-life of caffeine. And a worst-case scenario, decrease the dose. You know, if you're, again, this is just my biased opinion, if you're pinging 400 milligrams on a daily basis, I would recommend probably cutting that down. Probably some other lifestyle issues you need to look at. If it's a temporary thing and you're, shift worker or whatever, and you've got 1 or 2 days that's higher, okay, maybe that's fine. Again, it's for each person to decide. But just be aware that the effects that it can have and try to work around it and do your best. And number one advice for sleep is go the F to bed. Try to go to sleep earlier. Again, in the cert, I talk a lot about AM sunlight can be helpful for regulating circadian rhythms and all that kind of stuff. That's a whole separate topic. But have some evening routine, have an AM routine. It can be very simple. It doesn't have to be, 4 hours of all this, stuff you do. Just keep it simple. And when in doubt, just go to bed and try to go to sleep sooner. So there you go. There's a talk on the effects of caffeine, how it is related to sleep, and gave you some practical tips of what to do with yourself and your clients so that they can still have their coffee and still have good sleep. If you're interested in more about nutrition and recovery, I have the Flex Diet Cert. Just go to www.flexdiet.com for all the information. Depending on when you read this, we'll have all the info when it opens up again. It's primarily geared at body composition improvements and performance. We have 8 different interventions from protein, carbohydrates, NEAT, sleep, micronutrition, a whole bunch more. We talk about the theory of metabolic flexibility and flexible dieting, give you a breakdown of the research of each intervention, and then you'll have 5 action items for each one, so you'll know exactly what to do for yourself and for your clients. So go to flexdiet.com for all the information there. You can sign up on the wait list. Most information I have goes out over the free newsletter that you can hop onto there. Thank you so much for listening to this talk. Thank you so much for making it all the way to the end. I really, really appreciate it for letting me geek out about all things caffeine. Hopefully you picked up some tips that you can be aware of. Even if you just got 1 or 2 tips out of this that you can go out and apply right now. To me, that's always useful, and you can help yourself and help your clients. Thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it, and hope to talk to all of you soon. Take care.